Welcome to the Game Design Hacks. This is the very first episode, and I am Dale.
And I'm the other hack, Tom.
In this episode, we're going to discuss the board game design of Super Mario Party and the text box design of Planescape Torment. Feeling ready?
Yeah, ready as I'll ever be. Oh man, I fucking stumbled on the first word.
Cool. So the Game Design Hacks, it's our brand new podcast where we talk about the various aspects, decisions, and implementations in various game designs. And we're actually going to be making a few prototypes on the podcast as well and testing them out. But mostly it's going to be discussing various aspects of game design and game design decisions in games that we've seen or played recently.
Yeah, and we're not just looking at sort of the biggest and brightest games. We're also having a look at some of the games that didn't quite work out. Games considered flops. We kind of want to have a look at, no one ever sets out to make a bad game, so we're trying to work out what the designer's original vision for the game was, what the nugget of gold in these games were, and what they might have done to have made these games better when they implemented them.
Absolutely. I think we'll find some really interesting stuff there because quite often, yeah, as you said, it's not just the good games that have good ideas. Some of the bad games have good ideas at the start too.
Yeah, and it's also an excuse just to talk about the games that we're playing at the moment.
Absolutely. All right, so a little on who we are. I am Dale. I work as a full-time programmer. I've got a history working in the games industry. I'm working as a regular industry programmer or other industry, general software now. But I've spent a long time in mobile games in particular and a lot of time working on prototypes and R&D teams. As a hobbyist, I make games as a solo game dev. I'm quite enthusiastic about finding ways to keep that interesting and to keep that around the outside of a full-time job. And I'm quite passionate about indie game making, about the process, and about interacting with people that share their process in making indie games, whether they be doing it full-time or part-time like myself.
Yeah, and my name's Tom. I'm currently working as a games programmer in the UK, and I've got a keen interest in tabletop games, be they board games or tabletop role-playing games, as well as hobbyist indie game development for video games.
And we've definitely worked on some game design projects ourselves in the past. We've definitely designed more than developed a ton of different games together.
That's the fun part.
Yeah, that's it. We always seem to peter out at around about the post-design doc phase. But we've also done a bunch of game jams together too, and have had some fun doing that. 48-hour game jams.
Yeah, and we like talking about games, so this podcast just lets us do that.
Exactly. I guess that brings us to our first regular segment. I guess we can't call it a regular segment yet, but it's the Game Design Diagnosis segment.
Ooh, can we have a musical sting for this one as well?
Doctor, give me the news. I got a bad game that needs to improve, so how can I fix these game reviews?
Cool, so what have you been playing, Dale?
All right, so recently the bad game design, which keeps kind of kicking me in the face every time I go to bring it out, is actually Super Mario Party by Nintendo on the Switch. And this one was quite disappointing for me, as I've been a long-time Mario Party player, and I mean, this game looks really nice, and it definitely has that Nintendo polish. But it's got some really odd design decisions in it, some which make it very difficult to recommend as a party game. And I just keep bringing it out, thinking it's going to be like another Mario Party game, kind of forgetting about how poor the pacing is. And I mean, let's just get into it. Let's talk about the regular board game, the age-old Mario Party board game. They've been doing this for, I think they're up to 11 editions now. It's not the original team. It was originally a team called ND Cube. I think no, it was originally Hasbro, and it's now a team called ND Cube, who are actually owned by Nintendo. And they've had that board game sort of formula going pretty much throughout. They had a departure at around about 9 and 10, where they put all of the players in the same cart, and that really sped things up. But during that, one of the things that they tended to do was to bring the number of extra sequences in. And now that they've split the players out, probably the most annoying thing about it is that those long sequences are still there, but now there's 4 times as many of them because the players aren't experiencing them together. And so this party game tends to be very much just you going through these unskippable sequences where you pick the dice and then you roll the dice and then you move and then there's something on the space and then something changes, and it's really long. Like these animations are really nice, but when you're seeing them, 20 times a game for every player, so 80 times a game, it really, really starts to weigh you down.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because it's clearly trying to appropriate the feeling of a board game, but it's like taking all the worst parts of playing a board game.
Yeah, there's so many things where you feel like just screaming hurry up at it.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm not the most patient person, but I think I had a little bit less trouble with the timing of Twilight Imperium than I had with Mario Party.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like another funny thing, because like Mario Party's been around for almost 20 years, maybe longer than 20 years now.
Yeah.
The first one was a 64 game, right? And in that time, in like the real physical board game space, there's kind of been this renaissance around game design, and a lot of these sort of old ideas about, what board games should be have been thrown out, and much better games have been created because of it. Because Mario Party's got this lineage where, the first game came out 20 years ago, it's sort of stuck with these old ideas and hasn't evolved with it.
Yeah, if anything, it's actually doubled down on some of that stuff. They've mistaken, like making a more lavish sequence as a more interesting thing. And I mean, it might be in isolation. Each one of these may be more interesting the first couple of times you experience them, but yeah, they really draw it out. And then it used to be a thing too that the AI players, you could set a setting so that they would play in fast forward. And when it changed hands from Hasbro to ND Cube, they didn't bring that along with it. So you're watching the AI players make their emulated decisions in excruciatingly emulated real time.
Yeah, well, it's I guess it's to simulate that one mate that you always have at the table that just takes way too long with their turn in Monopoly or whatever you're playing.
Yeah, so awards for realism, but maybe not for fun.
Well, I mean, speaking of Monopoly, it takes probably my absolute pet peeve worst game design aspect from Monopoly and lots of board games, but it's rolling to move.
Yeah.
Nothing kills my interest in a game faster than rolling a dice to decide how far along a track you move. It just sort of removes any kind of agency you have over the game. And as we all know, games are about making interesting decisions.
Well, yes, actually, and that probably neatly brings me to the other part, which is they did solve a part of that, at least. They still have roll to move in this new game mode, which I think it's called Star Mode, and I think it's a holdover from the 3DS version from a couple of years back. And that is, you roll the die still, but you and your partner, because it's 2 players versus 2 players, both roll your die, and then the total of both of your dice, all right, I'll get the pluralisms right by the last episode of this podcast, but right now I'm going with dice.
Oh yeah, people will slaughter us if we don't get that right.
Well, we're game design hacks. We're not we're not the experts. But yeah, so this mode, star mode, allows you to pick your direction. So you can choose where you go around the board. But the die roll causes a little bit of a problem where odds and evens are important. So you kind of have to get the right number of spaces for the one that you want to move to, which is, I mean, we can all agree that that's usually terrible, but if you're picking your direction, you can kind of flub it and you can move around in any direction and weave a path until you get to where you want to go. But that ends up having an odd side effect where if you're, the space that you might want to land on is either like it's got to be an even or an odd number of moves away, and there's no amount of maneuvering that you can do to stop it from being within reach if you don't have the right odd or even. So while they've gone for a very tactical design for that section, quite often you'll end up being outmaneuvered by someone who's just luckier. And I know that luck has forever been a staple in the Mario Party series, and sometimes that's not people's favorite thing, but I would say in the mode that's meant to be tactical, that's where you really want to try to cut down on the number of shenanigans.
Yeah, well, luck obviously has a very central place in gaming and, historically has, especially in, gambling gaming. But you still need to make a decision. If you're playing blackjack, the decision is, do I take another card or do I keep pushing my luck? Whereas in a game that's roll to move, you don't really have a choice. You need to roll the dice every time, and the outcome you've got no influence over. I've seen games which have tried to make it an interesting decision. Did I ever play Formula D with you before I moved overseas?
I don't think so.
It's a car racing game. And the idea is you roll to move, and that's how far you can move your car along. But you've got different gears, and different gears are different sizes of dice. So you start off in first gear, and you're rolling a d4, and you can choose to gear up, and that lets you roll a d6. And the interesting decision that you're making is you've got these turns which you have to stop in, or else you crash your car. So then the decision becomes, well, do I gear up to go faster so I can move ahead of everyone else, but, risk not landing in these corner positions? Or do I, play more conservatively, but, risk other people getting ahead? So you've got there's a decision to be made, and there's, a risk and reward that makes it interesting and engaging. But
yeah,
that's sort of the only sort of roll to move game that I can think of that's made that roll an interesting decision.
Well, actually, that touches on, because as you mentioned, we're going to try to, debug these games or come up with maybe short rules that might allow that to be, fixed. And I think potentially for the roll to move one, particularly in the tactical star mode, I think it should just be that's the maximum number of spaces you're allowed to move.
Yeah, though I guess it's been a while since I played Mario Party, but there are intersections that you get to where you get to choose which direction to head in, right? Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, that in the regular board game version there is that, yes.
Yeah, so I guess that's giving you a decision there, but I don't think that's an especially interesting one. On some of the decisions some of the stages rather, where, there's explosive areas or some sort of threat if you go one route versus another, that creates an interesting point, but maybe that could be something that we toy with in our solutions section.
Yeah, I'm just going straight to the solutions now, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, in the one that you were saying there, because the other thing is the board variety is not really great in the regular Mario Party mode. So for me, that problem is that there isn't enough of that risk-reward stuff that you just mentioned, where you get to take a hazardous path that's a bit shorter so that you might be able to get to the star first or something like that. The boards that come in Super Mario Party don't really have much of the risk reward pathing that used to be in the old boards, because they used to have really giant old boards, and these ones are much more condensed. And I think they've condensed them because of the sheer amount of time it takes to get through them, because of the unskippable sequences that they've got. So they've really kind of painted themselves into a corner and kept designing around it. That's in the regular board game mode there. And I think, if they had have upped the variety, as you said, add more risk reward to that. The roll to move thing is going to be there for the regular mode. And I think having the alternate mode, which we'll touch on again in a moment, there is it's a good idea and a good way to negate that. But I think if you're going to have roll to move, then you need to be able to have those decent intersections, and they need to mean something. They need to be quite significant. Like, there was always that risk that you'd cross a bridge and be sent back to the start if you took the shortcut. Or, there used to be things where you could get to an intersection and then pay a price to have somebody gatekeep that intersection, which meant that you really had to get there first, and then you could kind of be the gatekeeper behind. So those sorts of things, because you used to move so much more quickly and so much further, that was really a good thing that they it feels like it was lost in translation between the two teams, that was what the original team kind of had. You've got to move quickly and very far. But I think the regular board game was never going to be anything other than, a trumped up version of Snakes and Ladders anyway. Yeah. And that's fine, because it's always been about the mini games, but surprisingly, they still managed to degrade that experience quite significantly. And then the promising one, which is the star mode, the 2-player direction-based one, just having it so that you have to take the number of moves on your die total means that you really don't get to be quite as tactical as you want, and it's all about whether or not you got the right number on the die again. And it's an absolute tragedy to me that that's based on the exact die roll. And I would say, my recommended solution there would be just let them take any number of moves up to the die roll.
Yeah, that's that gives you a little bit more leverage there.
Yeah, if I roll a 10 and the star is 3 spaces away, let me just take the 3.
Yeah, and it might also be interesting to use that as a way to maybe block other players. Actually, what happens if 2 players land on the same square?
The second one lands on the other person's head and takes 3 coins off them in the new one.
Okay.
In star mode, but otherwise they're allowed to occupy the same space. In the older games, it used to be that there'd be a duel between you and the other person, and the person who arrived from memory, I might get this wrong, I think the person who arrived there the person who arrived there first gets to set the price of the duel, and then they both battle for that number, the total pool of coins. And it was a duel minigame.
Yeah. I don't know if this is a problem you've had with Mario Party before, but I've been to so many actual parties where people are playing Mario Party where there's more than 4 people that want to play Mario Party.
Yeah.
And it kind of seems like in an age where, 4 controller slots isn't really a problem anymore. That kind of seems like a arbitrary limitation.
Oh yeah, particularly on the Switch, where you've got each controller is 2 controllers. So 4 controllers, 2 come out of the box, and then the next time you go and buy a set, you've got 4 already. You've probably got an extra Pro controller, which you can't use in this, by the way. But everyone's kind of got 4 or more Joy-Con lying around, and they're pretty easy to sync too, so you might get someone else with a Switch to come along, and all of a sudden you could do 8 players quite easily.
Yeah, I guess there's some issues around, balancing mini-games and stuff like that, but I guess you don't have to have, every participant or participating in every single mini game. Like, you could try and do something interesting with, spectators being able to, influence something or just be able to run around in the background. But it's, it always feels like when I break out Mario Party, there's somebody that has to sit and watch for a game.
I agree. Recently, I played with a group of 12 people, and we played in sets of 3, where every team controlled one character in a round-robin fashion. And it took us about 2 hours to play the easiest version of the game, because it takes so long between turns that people would forget that they were playing Mario Party. They'd be off in another room and they haven't played Mario Party for an hour. So, they come back and they'll be like, "Oh, what are we up to?" And they need a full introduction. And yeah, it was just not a very party game. Like, it's actually very
It's in the name.
very antithetical to a party. Yes.
Yeah, like 4 people, that's a shindig at best.
Yeah. The Mario Hangout.
I mean, if they let you play Smash Bros with 8 people, then you should be able to play Mario Party with 8 people.
Yeah, or even if they just shoehorned in some tiny little round robin mode that kind of did the work for you there, or I don't know. It just, everything about Super Mario Party feels laboured and long and kind of a little bit antisocial.
Yeah. But, like, I mean, people keep buying it because there's the promise of the game is solid.
Yeah.
Like, a game of mini games that you can break out with a group of people, and it's sort of very low barrier of entry. It's quick and punchy. You can drink in between rounds.
Yeah, and the way that it kind of, like, the minigames themselves this time around are absolutely excellent. Like, they're probably the best they've ever been. They've been good for a couple of editions, like 9 and 10 were actually quite decent too. Those have improved out of sight. And it seems to me like the dev team knows that and kind of wants to move away from the board game, because there's an online mode, but you can't play the board game online. You can only play the mini games online. There is a bunch of like other sort of gauntlet style things where, again, they just throw mini games at you, and the overall game is not a board game. It's just some other competition, like rowing down a river, that allows you to play mini games every 100 meters down the river or something. And it's like,
Yeah.
it seems like they know they're on a stinker.
Yeah, and like that's what I remember from, the years since I played the new Mario Party is, me and my friends rowing down a river. It's, I don't remember any of the board game layouts.
Yeah.
But say, hypothetically, Mr. Nintendo gives you a call and says, "Dale, you're in charge of designing the next Mario Party. Do you think the board game section can be saved, or would you just cut it all together?"
Absolutely. I think it can be saved very easily. And I've done a little bit of prototype work on this too. The trick is you've just got to speed it right up, and you've got to make sure that absolutely everything is sped up. Again, that star mode stuff that they did, it's really promising. There's a solid idea underneath star mode and having you pick the directions. I think if they sped that up, if they didn't require you to take the number of places that's there, and even if you're back in the regular board game, like, lose some of the symmetry of the boards, get some weird risk-reward stuff going, speed the AI players up, because I ain't got time to wait for a machine to pretend to be a human in front of me. I can't talk with them anyway, so I can't influence their decisions. So, just hurry that up. It's not necessary. And, I don't need to see the same rigmarole. I don't need an explanation every time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, so I get worked up by this one.
Well, I wonder if there's some way to, include the other players when it isn't their turn. Because, this isn't a problem that's unique to Mario Party. Like, lots of turn-based games sort of have this problem where, if somebody has an especially long turn, you're just sort of sitting there twiddling your thumbs, and you're not necessarily interested in what they're doing, especially if it doesn't affect you directly. Yeah, like I'm sort of thinking of other board games that have done this interestingly. I don't know how it would translate to Mario Party, but the one that I always think of is a game called Tales of Arabian Nights, which is it's kind of like an adventure game in a board game where you sort of each player plays a character traveling around, Arabian mythology, having adventures. But the way other players are sort of involved during your turn is the person to your left, I think they sort of read out what you can do on what particular square you land on, and then the person on your right sort of tells you the outcome of the action that you take, which, again, like I don't know how that would apply to Mario Party, but I always thought that was like an elegant way of including people in your turn, so it's not just sort of four people having isolated experiences. It sort of becomes much more communal, which, the mini games of Mario Party definitely are. It's just that goddamn board game bit that wraps around it.
Yeah. It's and it's very much like it's one of those classic board games. It's a Trouble or a Snakes and Ladders. It's kind of in need of innovation.
Yeah, it's the ones that's in, your Nana's cupboard that you play on, Christmas after lunch. And yeah, like I mentioned earlier, like board games have come further. Like it kills me that Monopoly is the game that everybody has in their house. It's like, I think I'm not a huge fan of Settlers of Catan, but I'd play that over Monopoly like any day of the week. And I think, if anything was going to be the board game that everyone has in their house, it should be Settlers of Catan. Like, that should be the baseline for what's an acceptable quality of board game.
Well, somewhat ironically, the last game in the Mario Party series to be run by Hudson actually had a mode which was similar to Monopoly, but it was much faster than Monopoly. And it actually solved a lot of Monopoly's problems, but because Hudson were getting quite experimental with the board game part by the time they got through 8 editions of Mario Party, as you would expect. And even though the minigames were a lot worse and the presentation, it was less pretty, but it was definitely more functional. And I just kind of hope that that ND Cube kind of figures that part out, because it definitely feels like in this latest one, the only reason why they've gone back to having individual players is because there was a reaction on the internet to having all the players lumped together in a car, and none of the rebalancing and retiming that is required to get 4 players going around the board again is there. Maybe there's some kind of simultaneous play, like maybe having everybody roll at the same time and move at the same time could be an interesting thing.
Yeah, trying to think if there's any real-life board games that have done that. I'm sure there has. Everything's been done in board games before. It's just whether people have heard of them or not.
Yeah.
I'd love to do an episode on Monopoly sometime, though, because I think that's a rich vein of bad design decisions.
Coming soon to the Game Design Hacks, an episode on Monopoly. Absolutely.
Especially if we can work out what the actual rules are, because I think every time I've played that, everyone's got a different interpretation of how that's supposed to be played. Yes,
actually, while I was working in a games company, one of the guys that works on analytics and stats showed me the actual, basically he'd done a bunch of calculations on the run time of a game with and without the free parking house rule that people introduce. And the average time for a free parking game was about 7.5 to 8 times longer than a game without it, because it kept reviving people based on luck alone. People that had no business still being in the game because they'd made terrible decisions but keep landing on free parking and getting a couple of $100, which is enough to get them around the board a few more times. Yeah, the house rules need to stop. That's for damn sure. But yeah, going back on the Mario Party thing there, I think the simultaneous one is really interesting to me because you'd get a couple of really nice risk-reward things out of that. Like early mover would get the star first, but at the same time, if you're a later mover, then you get to see benefit from seeing what the other people did. And everybody's kind of got a time box, maybe Jackbox style, where they've got to make their moves or spend their action points. I would really like to see a version of Mario Party that allows people either to play at the same time or have some form of tactical move order selection.
Yeah. I know, just even base the map board off a different board game. Like maybe Mario Party Risk.
Yeah.
Conquer the Mushroom Kingdom.
Mario Party Chess, but it's 4-sided chess. And only the winner of the minigame gets to make the next move.
Or Mario Party Twister. It's just a physics game.
Actually, that's funny because ND Cube made Wii Party. And Wii Party has the rule where the winner of the minigame gets to roll first. And they get more moves than everybody. They get more die than everybody else.
Yeah, actually, that's not a bad idea.
It's not bad. Yeah. So these guys have done it before.
Yeah, there's no such thing as an original idea.
And they fixed it. Yeah, they just must not be allowed to do that to Mario Party. There must be something stopping them from, whether it's a Nintendo decision or it's an audience consideration.
Yeah, I wonder if there's like a dedicated hardcore Mario Party fan base out there that sort of, has a backlash against some of these design decisions.
Yeah, because they're definitely Sonic teaming at the moment. They're just erasing their previous decisions willy-nilly because the previous game's one aspect didn't work.
Yeah.
So, all right, back to the drawing board every single game.
So many babies thrown out that bathwater.
Baby Mario, Baby Peach.
Baby Birdo.
Yeah.
My favourite.
Is there a Baby Birdo? Is that a Mario Kart one or...?
Well, I mean, surely Birdos don't form, fully formed, right?
I guess they come from an egg.
Yeah. And then there's a baby Birdo, and then they grow up and their feathers come out.
Out the mouth.
I don't know. If you're familiar with the biology of Birdo, please write in and let us know.
Let us know about the birdos and the bees. See, this is not just a game design podcast. We also show you fictional biology. I think that's probably enough on Super Mario Party. So, Tom, tell us what you've got for your bad game design or fix-it game design. I don't know, what should we call these? In need of improvement game designs.
Yeah, that's a very kind way of putting it. I've been on holiday recently, so I've been catching up with all the games that I should have played 20 years ago and haven't. And I played Planescape Torment, the enhanced edition on the Nintendo Switch.
Right, so this is a remake.
It's a HD re-release.
What was the original?
The original is just a straight PC game.
Right.
Yeah, so it's like one of those classic Infinity Engine isometric CRPGs,
right.
Sort of in the same vein as Baldur's Gate and the original Fallout games, sort of that golden age of CRPGs. And like the Baldur's Gate series was like one of the first games that sort of made me fall in love with role-playing games, and I've sort of been obsessed with it my entire life.
Yeah.
But I never played Planescape Torment. Well, I guess I didn't really have a computer that could run it in the 90s. So I waited 20 years for it to come out on the Switch. And it turns out the Switch isn't great at running it either, because it is a buggy game that crashed quite a lot. But I persisted through it and got to the end.
Right, so tell us about the problems.
Well, the problem that I want to talk about is very specific. It isn't about the bugginess of it, and there were like a couple of design problems with it as well.
Okay.
Like I managed to get to the end game quite underleveled, and there's sort of a couple of it's like one of those role-playing games where, there's sort of pacifist options where you can like sort of talk your way through a lot of the conflicts in the game. But when you get to the end game, there's sort of like a point of no return where if you're not a high enough level to sort of talk your way through certain situations, you have to fight your way through them. And because I was underleveled, those were very, very difficult fights, and I hadn't sort of come across anything like that earlier in the game. So I ended up having to drop the difficulty for the combat to get to the actual end of the game.
So would you say you were deliberately rushing, or?
I didn't think so. I sort of looked it up after the fact, and it looked like there were a couple of sections of the game which I just missed. But
Right.
I thought I was being pretty thorough, sort of doing side quests and things. Yeah, there's a really interesting video by the Extra Credits guys about one dungeon in Baldur's Gate called Durlag's Tower, I think it's called.
Okay.
But they sort of go through it design-wise and sort of regard it as like this, pinnacle of dungeon design in video games. And the first thing they talk about is to actually get into the tower, there's these two high-level creatures, which, if you can't sort of defeat them, they're basically acting as like bouncers to the dungeon. So that's sort of how you know that your character's at high enough level to deal with all the stuff within the dungeon. And Planescape Torment didn't have that. It sort of gets you into a point where you can't leave at that point and, go do other things until your character's strong enough to have a crack at the final couple of bosses. So you're kind of like stuck at that point. And because I'd been using the same save file over and over again, I couldn't reload to an earlier point either, without having to restart the entire 50-hour game again, which was frustrating. But that's also not the design problem that I have in mind to talk about. What I really want to talk about, which I think is a really, hot, sexy topic for our first episode, is text boxes.
Right.
So yeah, how familiar with those sort of like 90s CRPGs are you? Did you ever play Baldur's Gate or Fallout or anything?
I mean, I'm not going to lie, I haven't played many, particularly PC RPGs, no.
For shame.
I was a bit of a first-person shooter junkie in the 90s, so I didn't really get a feel for tactical games until sort of my mid to late 20s.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's understandable. I think it takes a particular type of nerd to sort of obsess over these types of games. It just so happens that I'm one of those kinds of nerds.
Yeah, good on you.
But basically what it is, so you've got your isometric top-down map of your characters, and you move around the world there. And then right at the very bottom of the screen, there's like a thin slither of text box, which most of the interesting parts of the game is played in. So, with these games are like a very deliberate effort to try and bridge the gap between tabletop role-playing like Dungeons and Dragons and video games. And, sort of the biggest part of that is, storytelling and narrative and, playing a character. But all these games, and I did like a quick look to try and work out when it started. So there was the 1988 game Wasteland.
Yep.
Was sort of the earliest one. It might not be the earliest one. That's the earliest one that I found that sort of had all the, narration and dialogue, and, dialogue choices being contained to this little box that's sort of centralized in the bottom, third or quarter of the screen.
Right.
And it's just a really bad way to experience the game. So once you get around to the mid-2000s, these sort of isometric RPGs stop getting made, and you start seeing, the Elder Scrolls franchise take off, and, games like Mass Effect, where those dialogue boxes are sort of replaced with subtitles.
Yeah.
And it's around the same time that, voices, games start getting, fully voice acted. So that kind of makes sense as a decision. And you get, those, dialogue trees, like the radial, dialogue choices, where you sort of get, a snippet of what you want your character to say, and then they sort of narrate the rest.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember seeing Mass Effect and thinking this is a clear step up from a lot of the dialogue choices that I'd seen prior to Mass Effect, I guess.
Yeah, well, this was my favorite part about Mass Effect, was because it was like this very sort of early implementation of the, here's a snippet of what your character might say.
Yeah.
You get like ambiguity where you pick an option and then it's your character does like the complete opposite of what you thought they were going to do.
You picked ants, and he's like, I don't really like ants. We're going to blow up the enemy. And you're like, what?
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, like it sort of makes sense because, like I said, they're being voice acted. They're sort of 3D worlds, so you sort of get like a more cinematic composition of the screen as conversation's going on.
Yeah, some of those great idle animations that seem to carry for a little while people are considering what was just said.
Oh yeah, the glassy-eyed Bethesda stare. So then, yeah, that sort of becomes what RPG dialogue is. And then, a few years ago, you get the massive Kickstarter for Pillars of Eternity, which is the sort of revival of those old 90 CRPGs.
By Obsidian, yeah.
And I think, a lot of the original team that worked on those games as well. And then, yeah, there's, a whole bunch of other games that come out in a similar genre. I think there were plenty of RPGs being made in between those as well. I think there's a company called Spiderweb Games that makes the Avalon series, and I think that's just one guy that's been churning out these RPGs, like, for that 20-year gap. He's got a really good GDC talk on YouTube that people should check out, because it's about, how to survive as a game studio as, basically one person without ever having, like, a smash hit.
Oh, yeah.
Which I always find, like, really inspirational, and I rewatch that video every now and again.
It is a great video.
That's a man that'll tell it to you straight. Yeah, there's this revival of CRPGs. We're still kind of in it. Disco Elysium came out end of last year, start of this year, and sort of blew everyone out of the water.
Yeah.
Did a whole bunch of really interesting things. Before that, there was the Shadowrun game. And yeah, those are sort of two games that have found a solution to the tiny dialogue text box problem. And their solution was simply to move it to the side as a vertical panel, sort of a column along, the rightmost third of the screen. Again, another interesting video that people should look up with the lead designer of Disco Elysium, where he sort of talks about the design choices they made for that. And basically about how people read and what parts of the screen they're naturally drawn to. So people like to read text in columns.
Yeah.
So it makes sense to, lay it out basically like a newspaper or like Twitter.
Yeah.
You can see much more of the, conversation that happened before the part that you're up to. Like, that's a big problem with those old Infinity Engine games where, it gives you, like, text dialogue options of how you want to react, but then you have to kind of, like, scroll up through the previous dialogue or, text dump to try and work out what you're actually replying to.
Yeah.
Whereas this, you sort of see, it's like social media. You can see the conversation leading up to that point.
Yeah, it's interesting when you get a lot of bleed between sort of like social media informing user interfaces in games.
Yeah, and as a game designer, it makes complete sense to, pinch ideas from that because, there's, millions of billions of dollars being spent on, research and incrementally tweaking all those UIs to increase retention and user engagement, and that work is being done on this massive scale. So to sort of not learn the lessons from that is you're just leaving money on the table pretty much.
Yeah.
And it's one of the sort of heartbreaking things when Pillars of Eternity came out is, because it was, harkening back to the old Baldur's Gate games, it kind of felt like it needed to implement as much from them as possible without sort of... it modernized a lot of the design, especially around movement and things like that, but in terms of UI, UI's come a long way in the last 20 years.
Absolutely.
I was sort of thinking about why those text boxes might have been weighted to the bottom middle of the screen in the first place, and I've sort of speculated that it might have been to do with, just the size of CRT screens back then.
Yeah.
You've just got a, more squarely shaped screen. You can't sort of take up a vertical third of a screen without losing too much real estate. Whereas by the time, Pillars of Eternity came out, we were well and truly in the age of, 16 by 9, so...
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure resolution played a massive factor in that too, because a lot of those DOS games kind of rendering at about 320 pixels wide, and you'd see some outliers that would get up to 640, but predominantly they were very constricted for the number of pixels they could put both horizontally and vertically on a screen.
Yeah, and it's just sort of a testament to how powerful, those sort of text-based games are, that people are willing to fight their way through those terrible resolutions and just, text which is, ruined an entire generation's eyesight to, play these games.
Yes, I was playing Link's Awakening recently, and that game, if you haven't played it recently, or you've played the Switch version, you'd be forgiven for forgetting that a third of the damn screen is text most of the time, that you're in dialogue. And, a quarter of it is items when you're outside of dialogue. So, yeah, constrained resolutions used to inform so much of the user interface design. Constrained resolution and sprite restriction used to inform so much of the old sprite design. And again, the sprite sheets having a lot of the time, every letter had to be the same size. So you end up not gaining... you lose space to not having natural spacing there and having to give every letter more room than it probably needs as well.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting to think about how these constrained spaces also influence the, writing and storytelling in the first place. It's like if you're writing a novel, you kind of don't have to worry about, how will this be laid out on a page? Whereas with, games, you go, okay, this character needs to say something, and it needs to fit in this size of the screen. And I wonder sort of how much of that is, because I've never written one of these games, how much of that is conscious during the time of writing, or, do you write the story that you want to tell, and then you have to go back and edit it down to, fit within one of these text boxes after the fact?
Yeah. Actually, I was doing a little bit of a hobby Game Boy game demo a couple of years back, and I ended up having to write dialogue that would fit, and so you end up simplifying, and then you end up with a character that has a simpler way of talking, and so their personality comes across as more direct, and you have to find other tricks, a lot of the Game Boy games have ellipses at certain points, so you have to find a natural point to pause. So now all of a sudden your sentences are about 8 words long between pauses, and it's really interesting. And I'm glad I don't have to deal with that as a real limitation, I guess.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting problem.
Right. So you reckon give it a feed. Have you write in with comments, have it displayed on the right side, just like Disco Elysium, and it'll probably fix the problem.
Yeah, just do what Disco Elysium and Shadowrun do. Problem solved. Easy.
All right.
Or if you're Bethesda, just voice act your entire game and don't worry about it.
Yeah.
No text.
All right, cool. Well, I feel like we've fixed some pretty decent games here, both Switch titles, but the Switch has been fixed.
Yeah, you're welcome, games industry.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess we'll get on to the what are we playing section of the podcast. All right, so I've been playing Immortals Phoenix Rising, which is kind of Ubisoft's answer to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. And when I say it's their answer to it, I mean it's probably their echo to it more than an answer. This game, it has taken a lot of ideas from Breath of the Wild and maybe just sped them up a little bit. It's kind of like Breath of the Wild for the impatient person. Now, you'd think as an open world Ubisoft game, it might have some of the things that open world Ubisoft games are known for, namely towers, maps with tons of icons, identical to each other side quests. Well, in this case, Immortals Phoenix Rising is not a Ubisoft game at all, or it's not a Ubisoft open world game at all. It does have towers, but just like Breath of the Wild, you can't see anything on the map until you climb them. And then, unlike Assassin's Creed, having used the tower viewpoint, it doesn't suddenly show all the icons on the map. You can still find things from the tower, but you have to look for them with a telescope. And it's all that really organic design, nearly lifted directly from Breath of the Wild. So it's kind of a little bit cheeky, but they've put a lot of conveniences into it that make it a little bit more arcadey. And it seems kind of antithetical that you would want to take some of the time-consuming stuff out of Breath of the Wild because it's such a serene game and enjoying the world is important. This still seems to get a lot of that right, but it just kind of says, right, climbing is quick and easy, and it's not really going to be much of a problem for you. There's no rain, so nothing cancels your climb. Eventually, you get stamina plugins that make pretty much everything surmountable. It's just a lot quicker and a lot more agile than Breath of the Wild, but it is so heavily influenced from it that it's...
So it uses the Vista's rule of three?
The triangle trick.
Well, it's the game design thing, which I'm sure everyone's heard of at this point now, but it's the rule in an open world game that from any location you should be able to see 3 interesting places that you'd want to go to.
Okay, yeah, you can definitely see at least 3 places. It's very easy to see most of the map from most of the map. And I've got it on PlayStation and Switch.
Oh, man.
They've got cross-save. So, yeah, I was pretty keen on it. I got the Switch version, and I was like, this is really cool. And it doesn't look half bad. And then I was watching YouTube footage of the PlayStation version, and I was I was like, I could transfer my save? All right, yeah, I'm doing that, because even though they've done a great job getting it run on the Switch, seeing it run on a PS4 is... it's a lot nicer. But I still transfer the save back sometimes and take it with me on the Switch, on public transport and whatnot. And I'm in it for a while. It looks like there's a good, 40 to 60 hours minimum, and they're bringing out expansions. So I intend to play this game a lot.
Okay, I'll have to check it out.
I do recommend it. If you haven't played Breath of the Wild, I would say go there first, because it's definitely, it's definitely not just the originator, but it's a great experience in so many ways. But Breath of the Wild doesn't need that much help. I think they've got 16 million units sold, whereas this one's new, and it's a relatively risky investment from Ubisoft. So maybe actually just get Immortals Phoenix Rising. And if you don't have a Nintendo, then yeah, get this. It's a great way to experience some of the things that were so good about Breath of the Wild on, more high fidelity sort of machines, and you will appreciate that, especially with the number of points on the horizon that you're going to be highlighting, looking down your sight at, picking out, and then marching all the way over to. That's
my favorite thing to do in the world.
Yes, and this has got that like crazy.
Pointing and marching.
Yeah. Yeah, cool. So what about yourself?
Well, I've been playing Ni no Kuni, also on the Switch. So Ni no Kuni is a game that I tried to play on the PlayStation 3 like years and years ago, and I probably got like maybe, 5 or 6 hours into it. And then it just sort of dropped off my radar, either because I started playing something else or got distracted. But it's one that I always wanted to go back to and, finish to completion. I've never really been I've always struggled to get into JRPGs.
Yeah.
And then earlier in the year, I played Dragon Quest XI, and that was sort of my come to Jesus moment where, it sort of clicked into place and go, oh, okay, I get these now. So I'm sort of going into Ni no Kuni with a new attitude. But it's so far it hasn't quite grabbed me in the same way as Dragon Quest XI did. When I was playing, or before I picked up and started playing Dragon Quest XI, I saw a video of somebody who was a big fan of it, and they actually gave a recommendation of how you should play it. It says you should, play it for half an hour before you go to bed as sort of like a bedtime story. And if you start playing it that way, then everything in the game seems to fit into these very neat half-hour blocks. And It feels like, each time you sit down and play, you've played another chapter of the game, which is very satisfying. I've been trying to do the same thing with Ni no Kuni, but it doesn't quite have that same rhythm to it. Are you familiar with Ni no Kuni?
I have seen. I'm looking at some screens right now. I've definitely seen some shots of this before. I remember thinking this is a fantastic looking game. I really like the art style.
Yeah.
But I haven't played it. Yeah.
It is a very pretty game, especially even on the Switch. Yeah. I can't remember what Studio Ghibli's relationship was to it, whether they just sort of did the art direction or there's some sort of collaboration with the game studio there, and that becomes very clear in the world and the storytelling. And, because I think I'm 5 hours into the game now, or maybe a little bit less, those first few hours are very rich in story. You either spend a lot of time watching these really, beautiful cutscenes, which are, sort of traditionally hand drawn animation.
Yeah.
But that's sort of intercut with in-game engine cutscenes, which, it's not the same, but they're still pretty high fidelity, and the style sort of meshes very well with the hand-drawn stuff. But it's a lot of watching dialogue, watching animations, not a lot of actually playing the game. And through this very long storytelling parts, it sort of feeds you this tutorial, which I'm not entirely convinced I've left yet. Every now and again, they'll just sort of drop a little hint. But it's the gameplay isn't complicated enough to necessitate this super long tutorial.
Right.
And it might be different coming to it as, somebody that's got an interest in game design, because you can tell that you're in the tutorial in a way that, maybe your average punter can't tell.
Sorry, how many hours in did you say you were?
I reckon I'm probably about 4 hours in.
Yeah.
So I think I probably played for twice this amount, the first time I gave it a crack. I'm going to persist this way, and I think playing it on the Switch is a better way to do it. Like I said, the Dragon Quest XI trick of, playing for half an hour before you go to bed, is the right way to play these sorts of games.
Yeah, cool. Did you play Dragon's Quest on Switch?
Yeah, I did. You should get the tutorial for it, because not the tutorial, the demo for it, because it's probably the most generous demo that I've ever played for a game.
Okay.
I think I probably got 15 hours of game out of the demo, and kind of forgotten that it was a demo until I finally hit the wall saying, "Hey, give us your money if you want to finish this game."
Oh, that's good.
Which I was super happy to do by that point.
Okay, yeah, well, I'm definitely going to do that then. I mean, It's not Nino Cooney. I think you convinced me to play Dragon Quest XI. But
Yep.
yeah, Nino Cooney. Would you recommend that so far, or do you want to? Would you need a few fixes on it, or you think it's still too early?
Well, like I've only just sort of got into the gameplay proper now, where you're sort of introduced to the proper map, game map. To start off with, like, all the random encounters you have are very aggressive and not necessarily very difficult. So you kind of get swarmed by these enemies that run at you. You have to fight. You beat very easily, but you still have to do, like, sit through all the animations on either side of the encounter. So that ends up sort of, really dragging you down quite a bit. I think once you get to a high enough level, random encounters start running away from you instead of, running at you crazy-eyed and foaming from the mouth.
I like that.
But yeah, no, I think I need a couple more hours to assess it. But yeah, Dragon Quest XI definitely had a stronger start, and if you want to get into JRPGs and you've never worked out how to do that before, Dragon Quest XI fixed that problem for me.
Yeah, okay. I guess I don't really know whether I've got any JRPGs that I've played, because I guess Nintendo don't really, like, Zelda games and Paper Mario games are technically RPGs, but they're not JRPGs, right?
Yeah, I guess Paper Mario's approaching that, but it's still kind of very much its own beast.
Yeah.
Whereas, it's not like a Final Fantasy type game, whereas Dragon Quest XI's a lot closer to that. And
yeah, because I have been wondering what that's about, and I guess early forays into it, which have been, Final Fantasy games, haven't really captured my attention as much.
Yeah, that's like another series that I want to revisit, because from what I understand from friends who do play those games, it seems like it's evolved quite a bit in the last few years, which, might make it a bit more accessible to someone like me who was sort of put off by the earlier games, which just seem to be navigating through menus.
They got that dialogue box problem that you were describing.
Yeah, I've always appreciated the Final Fantasy games for, like, actually having rich fantasy worlds, because I find, like, a lot of Western ones seem to fall into the sort of Tolkien type world, or at least Tolkien adjacent. So sort of like a very narrow definition of what fantasy is.
Yeah.
But yeah, like the actual gameplay itself has always been a bit obtuse for me.
Yeah, and I guess another thing with a lot of Western RPGs is you do get... It's getting a little bit more variety now, but there was a lot of sort of grimdark fantasy stuff there too, where you had these incredibly bemuscled protagonists with swords that are, five-pronged, and they kind of... everything is just like a really hammed up thing, like the Darksiders kind of thing, or...
Yeah, it's just layering, plated armor on something until it's almost unrecognizable as a human.
Yeah, and everyone speaks like Batman. It's great.
Yeah, that's another point for Planescape Torment. It was a super weird world, and I loved that.
Yeah, cool. So I guess we'll look at maybe Final Fantasy in a future episode, and I think maybe I might bring the recent Paper Marios into the mix too, because I feel like they're quite easy to fix, but so fraught with problem. I'm gonna sound like I don't like Nintendo, and it couldn't be further from the truth. I have these opinions because I like them a lot, and yeah, I'm not gonna start finding problems with Mario Odyssey, or even though there's but it's mostly glorious, and same with Breath of the Wild, mostly very glorious.
So radical candor. That's what we're about on this show.
Yeah, absolutely.
We want to help the things we love.
Just complaining and pretending that it's useful. And you can expect more of that in future episodes of The Game Design Hacks. I've been Dale.
I've been Tom.
And we'll talk to you soon.